There are stories that have followed humanity since the dawn of time, lingering like fragments of memory buried deep within our collective mind. The Great Flood is one of those stories. We are often told it was divine punishment, a cleansing meant to wash away evil and allow the world to begin anew. But what if that explanation is only a veil, and behind it lies something far more unsettling? Some believe the flood did not simply sweep away people and animals. It may have erased an entire civilization, one that stood higher than ours, with knowledge, technologies, and cities whose brilliance we can scarcely imagine today. When we look at colossal statues half buried in the earth, at massive stone walls weathered by time, or at the ruins lying silent beneath the ocean, a question rises again and again. Could these be the traces of a lost world? A world that once flourished, only to be consumed by the waters as though it had never existed. And if that is true, then what we call the beginning of human history may only be the second beginning, the restart after a cataclysm that reset the world itself. Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story of the Great Flood begins in whispers, carried across the deserts of Mesopotamia, through the valleys of India, into the temples of Egypt, and across the oceans to the far corners of the earth. It is a story that refuses to remain confined within a single culture, a single tongue, or a single belief. The Bible speaks of Noah, chosen to build a massive ark while the world mocked him, until the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters did not retreat for months. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned by the gods of a deluge so great that only a colossal boat could preserve life. In India, the tale is of Manu, guided by a fish god to survive the waters that swallowed the earth. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion, the Maya of twin survivors, the Norse of Bergelmir clinging to a hollowed tree. And in every story, no matter how distant the people, there are the same elements: a divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, the preservation of animals and knowledge, and the promise of a new world born from destruction. At first glance, these tales feel like myth-making, the timeless human urge to explain the unexplainable. Floods are natural, after all. Rivers swell, storms rage, seas rise. A people struck by catastrophe might remember the horror through story, passing it to their children as a warning wrapped in symbolism. But what unsettles researchers is not the existence of one flood tale, or two, or even a dozen. It is the fact that over 200 cultures, scattered across continents and separated by oceans, tell almost the same story, with only the names changed. The details align with such precision that they cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It is like hearing echoes of a single scream carried through different canyons, each reshaping the sound, but never erasing its origin. If these stories are merely allegories, why do they all include not just water and destruction, but also vessels, chosen families, and the rebirth of the world? If they are independent inventions, why do cultures that never shared language, trade, or contact preserve the same sequence of events? To anthropologists such as James Fraser and Mircea Eliade, The answer was simple, yet chilling. These myths are not fiction, but memory. A memory of an event so vast, so traumatic, that it carved itself into the psyche of humanity, retold again and again until it hardened into legend. But memory has layers, and like any memory, some truths may have been altered, some details sharpened while others faded. What if what we inherited is only the shadow of the event, not the event itself? The idea that the Great Flood might not have been a localized story, but a global cataclysm challenges our entire sense of time. It suggests that beneath our feet, beneath the layers of soil and the sediment of oceans, lie the ruins of something older, something washed away not by centuries, but by walls of water hundreds of feet high, surging across continents. In the Pacific Northwest of the United States, there exists a landscape that looks like a battlefield abandoned by gods. Valleys carved too deep for their rivers, ripples frozen in stone the size of buildings, gorges cut as if by an invisible hand wielding unfathomable force. For decades, geologists struggled to explain it. The land simply did not make sense. Until, in the 1920s, a man named J. Harlan Bretz proposed the unthinkable. It was created by a flood so massive, so violent, that it would have drowned entire regions in days. At first, his idea was dismissed as ridiculous. Science prefers slow processes, erosion over millennia, rivers gradually shifting courses. But the Earth did not lie. Decades later, with the advent of aerial photography and satellite imaging, Bretz was vindicated. The channeled scablands of Washington state were indeed the scars of a cataclysmic flood. Mainstream geology now calls them the Missoula floods, triggered by ice dams bursting at the end of the last ice age. Yet outside the boundaries of mainstream thought, others saw in this evidence something more. If a single flood could reshape entire landscapes, why stop at one? Could this have been part of a chain reaction, a global series of cataclysms that wiped out more than just rivers and valleys? Researchers like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson have argued that the scablands are not just geological curiosities, but clues to a larger story, one of civilizations erased and histories rewritten. To them, the Missoula floods were not isolated, but part of a planetary reset. If this is true, then the flood myths of the world gain a new weight. They are not simply allegories of morality. They are recollections of survival, fragments of testimony from people who lived through the drowning of their world. Imagine standing on high ground and watching water devour everything you knew, forests, villages, temples, until all that remained was horizonless sea. Imagine passing that story to your children, knowing it must not be forgotten. Now multiply that by dozens of cultures across thousands of years, and you begin to see why the same story emerges again and again, told with different names, but the same heart. But even if the Great Flood is accepted as real, the question deepens. What exactly did it destroy? Was it only small tribes and scattered settlements? Or was it something greater, an entire civilization, one whose architecture, knowledge, and technology exceeded what we have today? This is the dangerous possibility, the one that lingers in the shadows of forbidden archaeology. Across the globe, we find ruins that do not fit into the timelines assigned to them. Structures so advanced in design and construction that they seem out of place in the cultures credited with building them. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe rises from the earth, a temple complex of precision-carved pillars standing for over 11,000 years, predating the pyramids by millennia. In Bolivia, at Puma Punku, stones interlock with such machine-like accuracy that even modern engineers marvel at the technique. In Egypt and Lebanon, massive megaliths form the foundations of temples, their size dwarfing anything created later. These anomalies, often explained away as coincidence or lost ingenuity, may in fact be something else. The fingerprints of a forgotten civilization, one erased by water and time. A civilization advanced enough to shape stone with methods we no longer understand, to chart the heavens with accuracy rivaling modern astronomy, and to leave behind fragments of knowledge that seem too sophisticated for their supposed age. If such a world existed, then the Great Flood was not just a cleansing, it was an erasure. And what we call human history may be nothing more than the second draft, written on the ruins of a story we have forgotten. The ocean hides secrets better than any vault. Beneath its surface, the remains of entire ages lie sealed away, protected by layers of silt and darkness. When the Great Flood is spoken of as myth, people imagine rivers bursting their banks or seas spilling over coastlines, yet the stories suggest something far more dramatic. An upheaval that buried cities and erased worlds. If the memory preserved in legend is true, then we should expect to find traces not on mountaintops or deserts alone, but beneath the waves where human eyes rarely wander. And that is precisely what divers, archaeologists, and explorers have begun to encounter. Fragments of geometry, stairways that lead nowhere, blocks of stone so perfectly cut that chance alone cannot explain them. Take the Gulf of Cambay, off the western coast of India. In the year 2001, marine archaeologists scanning the seabed stumbled upon what looked like an immense city sprawled across miles. Streets, foundations, and grid-like layouts emerged in sonar images, all more than 100 feet underwater. Initial studies suggested they could be 9,000 years old, long before the rise of the Indus Valley civilization, long before anything our textbooks recognize as urban life. Critics, of course, dismissed the discovery as natural formations, but the question lingers. How does nature carve out patterns so distinctly human? Streets that run parallel, rectangles that suggest walls and courtyards. To believers in the flood hypothesis, Cambay is not an anomaly. It is a relic, a drowned memory of the first cities built by survivors of a vanished age. Thousands of miles away, off the coast of Japan, lies Yonaguni. To the casual diver, it seems like a submerged fortress sculpted by unknown hands, terraces that rise like steps, pillars that stand in silent ranks, and flat surfaces cut at right angles. Mainstream geologists argue it is a quirk of erosion, sandstone fractured in tidy shapes by millennia of currents. But others, including the Japanese geologist Masaki Kimura, insist the sharp lines are too precise, the patterns too intentional. To him, Yonaguni may be the remains of a lost complex, perhaps 10,000 years old, swallowed by the sea at the end of the Ice Age when melting glaciers drowned coastlines. Standing before its massive walls beneath the waves, one cannot help but wonder whether these were once plazas where people gathered, or sanctuaries where rituals were performed, before the ocean claimed them forever. India offers yet another enigma. Dwarka, the legendary city said to be ruled by Krishna before it was swallowed by the sea. For centuries, Dwarka was considered pure myth, no more real than Atlantis. Yet in the late 20th century, divers off the coast of Gujarat discovered ruins, walls, pillars, and artifacts, lying exactly where ancient texts described the sunken city. The parallels were too striking to dismiss. While debate continues, for many the discovery breathed new life into the notion that myths often veil truths. Truths remembered in sacred stories because the events were too enormous to forget. These sites, Cambay, Yonaguni, Dwarka, are not alone. Across the oceans, whispers of drowned worlds surface again and again. Off the Bahamas, the Bimini Road presents a long stretch of stone blocks aligned like a causeway. Near Cuba, sonar scans have revealed geometric patterns on the seafloor that resemble streets and structures. Off the coast of Egypt, Heracleion and Canopus, once thriving ports, now lie beneath the Mediterranean, buried in silt for centuries until rediscovery. Each of these locations is debated, contested, argued over by archaeologists and skeptics. Yet together, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. They suggest that coastlines we know today were once crowded with settlements. Settlements that the sea consumed in a single generation, leaving their descendants to tell stories of gods, floods, and survival. If the waters truly rose that swiftly, then it was not gradual erosion, but a catastrophe. Imagine the sea level climbing not over centuries, but in days, driven by the sudden collapse of glaciers, by violent tsunamis, or perhaps by cosmic interference. A comet fragment, as suggested by the Younger Dryas hypothesis, striking the Earth and melting ice sheets in a geologic instant. Such an event would not only drown cities, but rewrite climates, redraw continents, and force humanity into exile upon higher ground. Survivors would cling to mountains, carrying fragments of memory and fragments of knowledge. And over generations, those fragments would transform into myth, myth into legend, and legend into the stories that still echo in our sacred texts. Yet ruins and sonar images alone are not enough to tell the full story. They are only the bones. To understand the flesh, we must look at what these drowned worlds imply. A city like Cambay suggests planning, engineering, and architecture far beyond the hunter-gatherer stage we are taught existed 9,000 years ago. Yonaguni suggests stoneworking skills equal to or surpassing many early historic civilizations. Dwarka suggests that oral traditions may preserve actual histories stretching back millennia. And when these are placed beside the legends of Mu, Atlantis, and other mother civilizations, the pieces begin to connect. Perhaps these myths are not inventions at all, but cultural memories of real places, real societies that flourished before the flood swept them away. The 19th century archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon was among the first to propose the existence of Mu, a vast continent in the Pacific said to have birthed all later civilizations. His ideas were dismissed, but they sparked curiosity. Later, James Churchward claimed to have seen tablets in India written by the people of Mu themselves, describing a sophisticated culture with knowledge beyond even modern humans. His accounts were dramatic, often criticized as fanciful, yet they resonated because they echoed what was being found under the seas, evidence that some great unknown had been lost. Even if Mu itself never existed as Churchward described, the idea it represents, the possibility of a forgotten progenitor civilization, remains tantalizing. And so the pattern emerges. Myths across continents, ruins beneath oceans, anomalies in stonework and architecture. They converge on the same haunting suggestion. before the civilizations we know, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, there may have been another world, advanced in ways we only dimly comprehend. A world that vanished so completely that history itself had to begin again. The flood, then, ceases to be a story of morality alone. It becomes the veil over an extinction. It becomes the boundary between two worlds, the one that ended and the one we live in now. And as the waves receded, what survived were only fragments, ruins, scattered artifacts, and the enduring whispers that found their way into myth. Yet even fragments can tell a story, if we learn to listen. When we step away from the ocean and turn our eyes back to the land, the mystery deepens. It is not only beneath the waves that the past whispers, but also in plains and plateaus, where ruins stand half-buried, challenging everything we believe about the origins of civilization. For centuries, archaeologists told us that organized society began around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that agriculture, writing, and monumental architecture emerged there and spread outward like sparks from a single flame. But the stones themselves tell a different story, one far older and far stranger. In southeastern Turkey, atop a dusty hill called Göbekli Tepe, a complex of massive stone pillars rises from the earth, carved and arranged with such deliberate precision that they form circles of power and meaning. These stones weigh up to 20 tons, each bearing intricate carvings of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, birds, etched with an artistry that speaks of symbolic thinking, of a people who were not mere hunters, but visionaries. Carbon dating places the site at roughly 11,600 years old, 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, long before the invention of the wheel, long before farming communities are thought to have existed. According to the orthodox view of history, such a site should not exist. Primitive hunter-gatherers could not have mobilized the labor, the tools, or the astronomical knowledge implied by Göbekli Tepe's design. And yet, there it stands, as real as the dust underfoot, silently accusing us of underestimating our ancestors, or perhaps of forgetting an entire chapter of human history. Then there is Puma Punku, high on the Andean plateau of Bolivia, a site that seems to mock the limits of prehistoric craftsmanship. Here, scattered across the Altiplano, lie colossal blocks of andesite and red sandstone, some weighing more than 100 tons. Their surfaces are cut so precisely that modern engineers compare them to machine work. Grooves, drilled holes, and interlocking shapes fit together like pieces of a vast three-dimensional puzzle, the kind of precision we achieve today with diamond-tipped saws and computer-guided milling. Yet mainstream archaeology insists the builders had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. How then were these blocks moved, lifted, and aligned with such accuracy? Were they remnants of a lost technique, a forgotten science handed down from before the flood? Or were they the desperate reconstructions of survivors, echoing an advanced past they could not fully replicate? Egypt, too, offers its own enigmas. The Osirion, buried deep beneath the sands of Abydos, does not resemble the elegant temples of the dynastic pharaohs. Its walls are built from massive granite blocks, rough-hewn yet fitted with uncanny precision, more reminiscent of megalithic architecture than of Egyptian stonework. The deeper one goes in the Nile Valley, the more the stones seem to grow. Larger, heavier, older, as if the earliest layers belonged to another people entirely, a people who vanished, leaving their foundations to be repurposed by those who came later. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the same puzzle appears. The Romans are credited with the Temple of Jupiter, but beneath their columns rest the Tralathon, 3 gargantuan stones, each weighing over 800 tons. No Roman engineer ever explained how such blocks were moved into place. The more one looks, the more it seems that the oldest structures are the most impossible, while the later additions grow smaller, more manageable, as if history is not a straight line of progress, but a long decline from forgotten heights. These sites do more than unsettle archaeologists. They challenge the very narrative of who we are. If the oldest ruins are the most advanced, then the timeline of civilization is not a ladder steadily climbing upward, but a broken cycle. Rise, fall, and rebirth. What if the people who built Göbekli Tepe, Puma Punku, and the foundations of Baalbek were not inventors but inheritors? Survivors of the Great Flood, carrying fragments of knowledge from a world that had drowned? Perhaps they remembered how to shape stone, how to align monuments with the stars, how to encode meaning in symbols, but lacked the means to recreate the full breadth of their former world. What remains, then, are ruins that look like beginnings to us, but may in truth be endings. The question is not just about stone, but about memory. Ancient myths tell of golden ages, of times when gods walked among men, when knowledge was given rather than discovered. The Greeks spoke of ages of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each age ending in catastrophe, each new one poorer than the last. The Egyptians told of Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods themselves established order before retreating into myth. The Maya, too, described cycles of creation and destruction, worlds born and destroyed by water and fire. Could these stories be more than allegory? Could they be cultural memories of a flood that erased not only cities, but an entire paradigm of knowledge? Standing at Göbekli Tepe, one senses not the beginning of something but the echo of a world already lost. The carvings seem less like primitive art and more like symbols, records of constellations, animals, cosmic events, etched by hands that remembered something extraordinary. At Puma Punku, the crisp precision of the stone feels like a signature, a message inscribed in blocks of granite. We were here, and we knew more than you imagine. And at Baalbek, the immensity of the Tralathon suggests not ritual, but infrastructure, as if they were the foundations of something practical, perhaps even technological, swallowed by time. If the Great Flood swept away an advanced civilization, these ruins may be the scattered tombstones of its memory. They resist our explanations not because they are miraculous, but because we are trying to interpret them through the wrong story. We look at them as the beginnings of progress, when perhaps they are the remnants of survival. The survivors of the flood may have passed down just enough knowledge to carve stone, to align temples, to preserve fragments of astronomy, but not enough to rebuild their world. History, then, is not the story of invention, but of recovery. And we may be little more than the children of catastrophe, piecing together what our ancestors once knew, never realizing how much was lost. The Great Flood ceases to be myth when the stones themselves whisper its memory. Each ruin becomes a fragment of testimony, a silent witness to the world before the waters rose. And if we dare to listen, they suggest something both awe-inspiring and terrifying, that humanity is not alone in the story of intelligence, that before us there may have been others, and that the flood was not merely a cleansing, but an erasure designed by nature, or perhaps by something else, to reset the world. Legends of lost continents haunt the imagination like mirages, half history, half myth, always just beyond reach. Among them, none are more provocative than the stories of Mu and Atlantis, civilizations said to have flourished long before the rise of Sumer or Egypt, only to be consumed by water and time. To the modern mind, these tales sound like fables, yet they persist because they refuse to fade. They reappear in myths of distant cultures, in inexplicable ruins, and in the whispers of scholars and explorers who dared to believe that the world we know is only the latest draft of history. The tale of Mu was first carried to the wider world by Augustus Le Plongeon, a 19th-century archaeologist who roamed the ruins of the Yucatan. To him, the pyramids and temples of the Maya were not isolated achievements, but echoes of something older. He spoke of a mother civilization, Mu, which he claimed had ceded knowledge to Egypt, India, and beyond. His claims were ridiculed by academia, yet they planted a seed. Decades later, James Churchward, a British soldier stationed in India, would expand the story into a sweeping vision of a lost Pacific continent. He claimed that secret tablets, revealed to him by a high priest, told of a civilization vast and technologically advanced, capable of feats that would stagger the modern world. To his readers, Churchward described Mu as a paradise of enlightenment, a land that cradled humanity's earliest sciences, only to vanish in a cataclysmic flood. He spoke of aircraft, energy systems, and temples that pierced the sky. Critics dismissed him as a dreamer, pointing out that the tablets he described were never produced, that the evidence was anecdotal at best. But the allure of his story was undeniable, because it resonated with something deeper. The persistent intuition that human civilization began not in one place, but with a shared inheritance from a world that no longer exists. Atlantis, too, occupies this realm between fable and forbidden memory. First described by Plato as a powerful island nation beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it was said to have fallen into the sea in a single night of catastrophe. Scholars argue that Plato's story was allegory, a moral tale wrapped in metaphor, yet his description was specific, too specific, some argue, to be dismissed as invention. He described a vast naval power, circular cities, advanced engineering, and a downfall brought by both hubris and disaster. If Plato invented it, he did so with unnerving detail. If he remembered it, then Atlantis may have been another name for the world that perished in the flood. Skeptics demand evidence, and perhaps they are right to do so. But evidence sometimes whispers rather than shouts. Consider Easter Island, a lonely dot in the Pacific, where hundreds of colossal Moai statues rise from the earth with an air of quiet defiance. The Rapa Nui people say they were built to honor ancestors, yet the precision of their construction and the sheer scale of the work continues to baffle engineers. How did a small, isolated population transport and erect statues weighing up to 80 tons? The island's oral traditions speak of knowledge passed down, of a legacy inherited rather than invented. Was that legacy a fragment of Mu, preserved in memory while the land itself drowned beneath the Pacific? When outsiders asked the islanders where their knowledge came from, the answer was simple, but unsettling. It was given. To whom? By whom? The lines blur, and the trail fades into the same mist that shrouds every story of a civilization before history. What connects the Moai to Mu, or Atlantis, or the Great Flood itself, is not proof, but pattern. Across the globe, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from South America to Asia, we find the same echoes. Structures too advanced for their supposed builders, oral traditions of ancestors who came from the sea, stories of cataclysm that destroyed entire worlds. Even when Churchward's tablets were discredited, the questions they raised remained. Why do we find similarities in mythologies oceans apart? Why do ruins separated by continents display similar techniques? Colossal stone blocks fitted without mortar, astronomical alignments so precise they rival modern instruments. Why do so many cultures speak of a time before the flood when gods or sages taught humanity the arts of civilization? If not Mu or Atlantis, then something else must have carried these stories through the ages. And here lies the deeper unease. If the Great Flood truly occurred, as geology and myth together suggest, then entire civilizations, whether called Mu, Atlantis, or names lost to time, could have been erased overnight. Survivors may have carried fragments of their world into ours, knowledge of stars, mathematics, or architecture. But fragments alone cannot rebuild a city, much less a civilization. The survivors' children would inherit tools they could not use fully, symbols they could not entirely read. Over generations, the memory of a shining city would collapse into legend, the story of gods or giants who once ruled the earth. The danger is not that these stories are false, but that they are true in ways we cannot easily measure. Beneath oceans, we see ruins that should not exist. In stone, we find craftsmanship that does not fit its age. In myth, we hear voices that echo each other across time and geography. Perhaps Mu was never a continent. Perhaps Atlantis was not an island kingdom. Perhaps they are names, attempts to capture in words what survivors could only dimly describe. The memory of a civilization so thoroughly erased by flood and fire that only fragments remain. If that is the case, then the Great Flood is not only a tale of survival, but also a tale of forgetting. It is the silence that follows catastrophe, the silence that can stretch for millennia. And in that silence, myths are born, not out of invention, but out of desperation to hold on to what was lost. Standing among the Moai of Easter Island, or gazing upon Plato's words about Atlantis, one cannot help but feel the weight of that silence. It presses on us even now, urging us to ask, how much of our past lies buried, and how much of our present is built on ruins we no longer recognize? What if the civilization erased by the flood was not human at all? For centuries, our imaginations have been bound by the idea that only humans can build, think, or invent. Yet the fossil record tells us that Earth has been home to countless species before us, each with millions of years to rise, flourish, and vanish. Among them, none loom larger in memory than the dinosaurs. We are taught to think of them as lumbering beasts, driven by instinct, doomed by an asteroid. But what if that picture is incomplete? What if, long before us, intelligence took root in a form we no longer recognize, and the flood was one of the blows that ended their story? In 2021, paleontologist Diego Pol studied the Maiasaura, a herbivorous dinosaur whose name means good mother lizard. What he found challenged the old stereotype of dinosaurs as mindless brutes. These creatures returned to the same nesting grounds year after year, building communal colonies where parents guarded eggs while juveniles foraged. It was evidence of memory, planning, even social coordination. They were not just surviving, but organizing, a behavior that hints at a level of intelligence beyond simple instinct. Then there is the Troodon, a small bird-like predator with a brain-to-body ratio comparable to mammals, grasping hands, binocular vision, and evidence of cooperative hunting. In the 1980s, paleontologist Dale Russell proposed the dinosauroid hypothesis. Had the Troodon not gone extinct, it could have evolved into a being disturbingly similar to us, with large eyes, dexterous fingers, and perhaps even language. Mainstream science scoffs at such speculation, but the question lingers. If the Earth is billions of years old, why assume intelligence only bloomed once, in us? Now, consider the possibility of a cataclysm. The dominant theory holds that an asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs 66 million years ago. But there is evidence that Earth's history is riddled with floods of unimaginable scale. Megafloods triggered by glacial melt, tectonic upheaval, or even cosmic interference. What if one such flood did not simply wash across continents, but drowned entire ecosystems, erasing not only species, but the traces of what they may have built? If intelligent dinosaurs, or any non-human civilization existed, their cities would now lie buried beneath miles of sediment and rock, indistinguishable from the ruins of geology itself. It sounds like fantasy, yet echoes of the idea ripple through myth. Ancient cultures often spoke of predecessors who were not entirely human: giants, serpents, beings of the sea. The flood, in these stories, did not just cleanse wickedness, but reset creation itself, clearing away entire races before humanity's rise. Could these myths be distorted memories of a time when intelligence wore another face? A time when the architects of civilization did not walk upright on two legs, but on clawed feet, feathered or scaled? If such a civilization existed, its traces would not be obvious. Unlike us, they may not have relied on fire or metal. Their tools could have been organic, their architecture unlike the stone we use, their symbols etched in ways long lost to erosion. A few million years would be enough to erase nearly every trace of our own modern world. Our skyscrapers crumbling into dust, our satellites reduced to rust in orbit, our plastics shattered into microscopic fragments indistinguishable from natural sediments. If another species reached even half our level of development tens of millions of years ago, what hope would we have of recognizing its ruins now? And yet, the sea holds mysteries we cannot explain. Off the coast of Japan, India, and Cuba, sonar scans reveal geometric structures. Some say they are natural formations. Others insist they are artificial. But what if they are so alien to us, not because they are from another culture of humans, but because they come from another kind of mind entirely? What if the patterns are not mistakes of erosion, but the fingerprints of a different intelligence, one whose logic was not our own? The flood becomes more than a story of survival. It becomes a mechanism of erasure. Whether by asteroid, comet, or glacial collapse, water has the power to cleanse not just the surface, but the memory of a planet. When the waters recede, what remains may be unrecognizable, fragments mistaken for chance, ruins interpreted as natural stone. To believe humanity is the only species to rise is to believe in our uniqueness. But Earth does not favor uniqueness. It favors cycles. Forests burn and return. Oceans advance and retreat. Species dominate, decline, and vanish. Why not civilizations, too? The notion unsettles us because it challenges the foundation of history. We prefer a straight line, chaos to order, primitive to advanced, caves to skyscrapers. But the flood stories, the buried ruins, the whispers of impossible craftsmanship, they suggest something different. They suggest a spiral, a cycle where civilizations rise, fall, and are forgotten, leaving only myths for their children to inherit. If a civilization of dinosaurs or other non-human beings existed, then humanity itself may not be the first experiment of intelligence on Earth. We may only be the latest. The survivors of such a catastrophe, if any existed, would not have passed down blueprints or machines. They would have left memories, stories encoded in symbols, fragments woven into the fabric of myth. Perhaps that is why so many flood tales speak of worlds before ours, of gods who walked the earth, of creatures banished by the waters. They may not be stories of imagination, but of remembrance, refracted through countless generations until the truth became unrecognizable. And so the question remains, what did the flood really erase? Was it merely villages of early farmers? Or was it cities of stone and light, belonging to beings we cannot even imagine? The silence of the fossil record may be less final than we think. Beneath rock, beneath ocean, beneath time itself, something may be waiting, forgotten, drowned, but not entirely erased. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily. It buries them under silt, cloaks them in currents, and hides them in the blue silence where sunlight cannot reach. Yet with sonar, diving expeditions, and sheer persistence, pieces of the past have begun to surface. Pieces that suggest the flood remembered in myth was not confined to scripture, but was a global event, a violent upheaval that swallowed coastlines and dragged entire cities beneath the waves. If the tales of Noah, Utnapishtim, and Manu are memories, then perhaps what they remembered were the very places that now lie drowned and forgotten on the ocean floor. Take, for instance, the Gulf of Cambay in western India. In 2001, a team of marine archaeologists using side-scan sonar detected what appeared to be the outlines of structures, grids of streets, geometric foundations, and rectilinear walls stretching across a vast underwater plain. When samples were dredged up, they included artifacts, beads, pottery shards, even a fragment of wood carbon dated to nearly 9,000 years ago. If accurate, this would make the site older than the great cities of Mesopotamia, older than the Egyptian pyramids, even older than Göbekli Tepe. Mainstream archaeology greeted the findings with skepticism, calling the evidence inconclusive, but the images remain haunting. The sonar scans show patterns that nature rarely produces on its own, patterns that look disturbingly human. To those who see in them the ruins of a drowned city, Cambay is not an anomaly. It is a confirmation of what myths have told all along. Thousands of miles away, near Japan's Ryukyu Islands, lies Yonaguni. Here, in waters barely 100 feet deep, divers discovered an immense staircase-like structure with terraces, columns, and platforms that look as though they were once part of a temple or fortress. Mainstream geologists argue that these are natural sandstone formations fractured by tectonic movement. But when you descend into that greenish half-light and place your hand against the sharp 90-degree angles, the explanation feels thin. The Japanese geologist Masaki Kimura spent years studying Yonaguni and concluded it was artificial, possibly more than 10,000 years old, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The debate continues, but the site's silence speaks louder than words. Standing on those underwater steps, one cannot help but feel that they were once trodden by human feet before the sea claimed them forever. India holds yet another enigma in the legendary city of Dwarka, said in ancient texts to have been ruled by Krishna himself before it sank beneath the waves. For centuries, the story was dismissed as myth, no more literal than Plato's Atlantis. But in the late 20th century, divers off the coast of Gujarat discovered stone walls, pillars, and artifacts lying beneath the sea, eerily close to where the texts said Dwarka once stood. The ruins suggested harbors, streets, and fortifications, hinting that the story may not have been myth at all, but memory. A recollection of a city drowned suddenly, its legacy preserved in scripture until rediscovery thousands of years later. The pattern repeats across the globe. In the Bahamas, the Bimini Road stretches like a man-made causeway beneath the water, with stone blocks aligned as though to mark a path for feet that will never again walk there. Near Cuba, sonar has revealed geometric structures on the seabed that resemble streets and plazas, too regular to be dismissed as mere coincidence. Off the coast of Egypt, the ancient cities of Heraklion and Canopus lay hidden under silt for more than 1,000 years until rediscovery in the early 2000s. Each of these sites tells the same silent story. The sea swallowed not just land, but memory, and only now do we begin to glimpse what was lost. But the question is how? How could so many cities, scattered across continents and separated by oceans, all meet the same watery fate? The answer may lie in one of the most violent chapters of Earth's climate history, the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden cooling and chaos that began about 12,800 years ago. According to the controversial Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a comet or asteroid fragment may have struck the planet, shattering ice sheets and triggering catastrophic floods. In a geological instant, glaciers melted, oceans surged, and coastlines drowned. The scablands of North America bear the scars of these mega-floods, carved in days by torrents of water moving faster than any river we know. If such forces could scour valleys and shift boulders the size of houses, what chance would a city have? Imagine standing in Dwarka or Cambay at the moment the sea rose, not inch by inch, but in a surge, a wall of water swallowing markets, temples, and homes in a single afternoon. Imagine living in Yonaguni as the ocean crept higher, day after day, until rooftops became islands, until stairways vanished beneath the tide. These are not gradual erosions, but sudden calamities, the kind of trauma that would sear itself into the memory of survivors. No wonder hundreds of cultures retold the same story. No wonder they spoke of gods and warnings, of vessels and chosen families. To them, it must have felt like the very judgment of heaven. When we put the pieces together, the picture is staggering. Cambay, Yonaguni, Dwarka, Bimini, Cuba, all of them seem to fall within the window of the Younger Dryas, that turbulent period when climates shifted and seas rose dramatically. The flood myths are not simply moral parables. They are testimonies. They describe a disaster so vast that it was remembered everywhere, in every language, reshaped into different names but preserving the same heart. They describe not a metaphorical cleansing, but a real catastrophe that ended one world and began another. What remains beneath the sea are not just ruins, but messages. They remind us that civilization may not be as young as we think, that humanity may have risen and fallen more than once. Each underwater site is a whisper from the deep, urging us to reconsider the neat, linear story of progress we tell ourselves. Perhaps the truth is cyclical. Perhaps history is not a ladder, but a wheel, turning endlessly, civilizations rising only to be swept away, leaving fragments for the next to discover. And so the Great Flood becomes not just a tale of water, but a metaphor for memory itself. It washes away details, erases names, but leaves behind enough, an echo in a myth, a ruin beneath the waves, for us to sense that something extraordinary once existed. We may never know its full shape, but in the silence of the ocean, the story waits, patient and unbroken. On land, the stones rise like frozen thunder, daring us to explain them. They stand in deserts, in jungles, on high plateaus, their surfaces scarred by centuries of wind, yet still radiating an uncanny sense of purpose. These megalithic monuments are more than ruins. They are puzzles, each piece whispering of an age we do not fully remember. While submerged cities like Cambay or Yonaguni tempt us with what lies beneath the waves, sites such as Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, and the Osirian confront us directly, challenging our timelines, our assumptions, even our understanding of what it means to be ancient. Take Göbekli Tepe, resting on a hill in southeastern Turkey. When Klaus Schmidt first began excavating in the 1990s, he unearthed a site that should not exist. Vast circles of stone pillars, each carved with animals and abstract symbols, dating back more than 11,000 years. That places it not in the age of cities or agriculture, but in the late Ice Age, when humans were supposedly still nomadic hunters. Yet here were pillars weighing 20 tons, arranged with mathematical precision, forming a sanctuary in stone. The carvings, foxes, scorpions, vultures, were not random decorations, but symbols, perhaps constellations, perhaps messages encoded for a future humanity. To stand there is to stand in the presence of minds as sharp and disciplined as our own, yet separated from us by 10 millennia. If Göbekli Tepe rewrites the beginnings of human civilization, Baalbek in Lebanon unsettles its middle chapters. High in the Bekaa Valley, the ruins of the Roman Temple of Jupiter rise impressively, but beneath them lie stones that defy reason. The Trilithon, 3 blocks of limestone, each weighing more than 800 tons, forms part of the foundation. Nearby lies the stone of the pregnant woman, a single cut block estimated at over 1,000 tons, left in its quarry as if awaiting a lifting technology we do not possess even today. The Romans, masters of engineering, added columns and temples atop these foundations, but they never claimed the stones below as their own. Archaeologists shrug, attributing them vaguely to earlier builders. But who were these builders? What tools did they wield to quarry, move, and set blocks of such colossal size? And why do such impossibilities always appear in the deepest, oldest layers of history? The Osirian of Abydos in Egypt deepens the enigma. Unlike the elegant, decorated temples of dynastic Egypt, the Osirian is raw and primeval, constructed from massive granite blocks fitted together like a puzzle. Its floor lies well below the level of the Nile, suggesting it predates much of the surrounding architecture. Mainstream Egyptology insists it is a symbolic tomb built in the era of Seti I, but its stark megalithic style bears little resemblance to the art of that time. To many, it looks like something inherited, an older foundation upon which later Egyptians layered their own history. The deeper one digs, the older the stones appear, as if each layer of civilization is merely a veneer over something more profound, something built by hands whose knowledge we have lost. This pattern repeats around the world. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, walls of immense polygonal stones interlock with such perfection that even a blade of grass cannot pass between them. The Incas, when asked, never claimed to have built them. They said the walls were already there, constructed by the giants who came before. In Bolivia, at Puma Punku, stones cut with machine-like precision scatter across the plain, forming shapes so exact they seem to come from industrial fabrication. Yet the people credited with them supposedly lacked even the wheel. Everywhere, we find the same story. The oldest structures are the most baffling, while later additions grow cruder, smaller, and more explainable. History, it seems, moves not forward, but in reverse, each new culture inheriting the ruins of giants and struggling to imitate them. What explains this inversion? The Great Flood offers one possibility. Imagine a civilization before our recorded history, one advanced enough to quarry and move megaliths, to align monuments with the stars, to encode knowledge in stone. When the flood came, it destroyed their cities, drowned their coasts, and scattered their survivors. Those survivors carried fragments of memory, how to shape stone, how to mark the heavens, but without the full knowledge or tools to rebuild what they had lost. Over generations, those fragments became traditions, and the monuments left behind became sacred sites. Later civilizations built upon them, adding temples, altars, and shrines, unaware that the foundations beneath their feet were the true legacy of a world erased. To mainstream archaeology, this theory is an affront. It suggests that our timeline is wrong, that our confidence in a steady march of progress is misplaced. Yet the stones themselves resist conventional explanation. They are too large, too precise, too old. They do not fit the story we tell, so we call them mysteries, anomalies, or coincidences. But perhaps they are not anomalies at all. Perhaps they are the fingerprints of a civilization wiped out by the flood, preserved in stone because stone alone could endure the waters. Even the myths seem to remember this. The Greeks spoke of ages of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each one ending in disaster, each one poorer than the last. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked among men and established order before withdrawing. In the Andes, legends tell of Viracocha, a god who emerged after a great flood to teach the survivors how to build, how to farm, how to live again. These stories, scattered yet resonant, all describe the same cycle. Destruction followed by survival, survival followed by rebuilding, rebuilding followed by forgetfulness. And so we stand among the ruins, at Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, the Osireion, Sacsayhuaman, Puma Punku, and we see not just stone, but silence, a silence heavy with memory, a silence that tells us we are not the first to carve the earth, not the first to raise monuments to the sky, not the first to watch our world collapse under the weight of water. If the Great Flood was the line between two worlds, these megaliths are the footprints of the one that came before. They are reminders that history is not a straight road, but a broken circle, and that we walk upon the ruins of civilizations whose names we no longer know. When we trace the myths of ancient cultures, a curious pattern emerges. In nearly every corner of the world, stories speak not only of floods and destruction, but of beings who arrived afterward, figures described as gods, sages, or shining ones who taught humanity how to live again. Were they divine messengers descending from the heavens, as tradition insists? Or were they the last survivors of a world that perished, bearers of fragments from a civilization the flood erased? In Egypt, the priests told Herodotus that their kingdom had endured many ages and many catastrophes, and that knowledge was preserved through cycles of destruction. They spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods walked among men, laying down the foundations of order and science. Some take this literally, as evidence of divine visitation. But perhaps those gods were flesh and blood, survivors carrying with them the remnants of a drowned age, cloaked in myth because their knowledge seemed godlike to the simpler societies that inherited it. The memory of builders who understood the stars and the stones may have hardened into the legend of deities who shaped the world. Across the Atlantic, in the high Andes, legends of Viracocha echoed the same theme. After a great flood, the stories say, Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca to bring knowledge to humanity. He was described as tall, bearded, robed, an unusual image in a region where the native population had no such appearance. He taught agriculture, architecture, and law before departing across the sea, promising to return. For the Inca, Viracocha was divine, but to modern eyes, he seems like a culture bearer, someone who appeared after catastrophe to restart the clock of civilization. Could Viracocha have been a memory of those who once built Puma Punku, Sacsayhuaman, or Tiwanaku, sites whose origins remain a mystery? The Sumerians, often credited as the first civilization, told of the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea after a great deluge. Half fish, half human, they brought writing, mathematics, and agriculture. They were said to have taught kings how to rule and priests how to interpret the stars. Once again, myth veils the image in supernatural form, but the essence remains. After destruction, knowledge returned, carried by figures who seemed more than human. Could these Apkallu have been remembered survivors, clinging to their identity by presenting themselves as emissaries of the gods? Even in Polynesia, halfway across the Pacific, stories tell of shining beings who came from islands that sank beneath the waves. They arrived by canoe or by light, bearing the wisdom of navigation, agriculture, and song. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was said to have taught humanity calendars, astronomy, and maize cultivation, only to depart across the eastern sea. The myths are countless, yet their theme is the same. After calamity, someone comes with knowledge, someone whose origins lie not in the present world, but in a world that is gone. What ties all these myths together is not only their content, but their persistence. How could so many cultures independently imagine floods followed by teachers? Why would stories of sages and gods carrying knowledge surface in places with no contact? The flood myths could be coincidence, born of shared human experience with rivers and storms. But the flood myths plus the teachers, the gods, the sages, that is harder to dismiss. It suggests that survivors of a catastrophe may have walked among scattered peoples, bearing skills, calendars, and stories. Over time, they were remembered not as men and women, but as immortals, their humanity erased by reverence. There is also the question of the knowledge itself. The Sumerians' earliest writings contain sophisticated astronomical records, including planets not visible to the naked eye. The Egyptians aligned their monuments with solstices and star systems, requiring a precision of observation rivaling modern astronomy. The Maya tracked Venus with uncanny accuracy. The Polynesians navigated the Pacific using stars, swells, and birds, techniques so advanced that only recently have we begun to understand them. Were these coincidences? Or were they remnants of an older global system of knowledge carried by survivors who remembered just enough to keep the flame alive? Perhaps this is why so many myths describe the bearers of knowledge as coming from the sea or the sky. To the survivors of destruction, the sea was both grave and womb, swallowing their world, but also carrying them to new shores. To those who encountered them, they seemed like beings who appeared from nowhere, descending with knowledge alien to their hosts. Over generations, the story hardened. They must have come from the heavens. They must have been divine. The truth that they were human or nearly human, refugees from a drowned land, was lost in the poetry of myth. If this interpretation holds, then myths of gods and sages are not fantasies, but distorted histories. They are the echoes of encounters between survivors of a lost world and the scattered tribes that inherited Earth after the flood. This reframes our understanding of myth itself. Myth becomes not invention, but memory in symbolic form. When a culture says a god came from the sea, it may mean that a ship arrived from a drowned homeland. When it says a being taught them to farm, it may mean a refugee shared seeds and techniques remembered from before the deluge. The implications are profound. It would mean that our civilization is not the first, but the second, or even the third. It would mean that our beginnings were shaped not only by invention, but by inheritance, by fragments passed down from people who lived through the end of another world. It would mean that when we look at myths of gods, serpents, sages, and shining ones, we are not looking at fantasies, but at blurred memories of real encounters, preserved in the only language survivors had: story. The Great Flood, then, was not only a cataclysm, but a turning point. It destroyed, but it also scattered. It drowned, but it also planted seeds. And the myths of gods and sky beings are the seeds that survived, carrying within them the memory of a world humanity has forgotten. To hear them properly is not to take them literally, but to listen to the heartbeat of history beneath their words. The gods may not have been divine at all. They may have been survivors, whispering across time that we are not the beginning, but only the continuation of a story as old as water itself. Every so often, an artifact emerges from the soil or the sea that does not fit the story we have written for ourselves. It sits uneasily in museum drawers or in the margins of archaeological reports, labeled anomalies, dismissed as curiosities. Yet when gathered together, these artifacts tell a quiet but powerful story. That knowledge survived the flood, carried in fragments, embedded in myths, and occasionally hidden in objects that seem centuries ahead of their time. They are like sparks from an ancient fire, glowing faintly even after the flames of civilization were drowned. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Antikythera mechanism, dredged up from a Greek shipwreck in 1901. At first, it seemed nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze. But when cleaned and studied, gears emerged, intricate, interlocking cogs arranged in a device capable of predicting eclipses, charting planetary movements, and modeling the heavens with astonishing accuracy. Scholars date it to around 100 BCE, but its sophistication rivals mechanical clocks built nearly 1,500 years later. Mainstream researchers argue it was the work of Greek genius, an isolated marvel. But some suggest it was not invention, but inheritance, based on much older designs. If true, then the mechanism is not the beginning of science, but a memory of it, a piece of knowledge salvaged from a world erased by flood, carried through the ages until it resurfaced in bronze. Egypt offers another enigma in the so-called Dendera light, a carving on the walls of the Temple of Hathor. To most Egyptologists, it is symbolic, a lotus flower emitting a snake, representing creation. Yet to others, it resembles something uncanny. A bulb, a filament, even a cable, etched in stone thousands of years before electricity was supposedly harnessed. Whether literal or metaphorical, the image provokes the same unsettling thought. How did ancient cultures acquire such imagery? Was it invention born of imagination? Or was it a symbolic memory of technologies once known and lost, remembered in the only language they had? Myth and art? In Bolivia, the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku stands as a monolith carved with strange glyphs and patterns. To Orthodox archaeologists, it is a ceremonial arch, aligned with solar events. But to others, its carvings resemble a calendar more accurate than many modern systems, mapping solar cycles with precision that seems impossible for a culture supposedly without advanced instruments. If true, then the gate is not just architecture, but encoded knowledge. Knowledge that may have survived the flood in the memories of sages, carried across generations until it was inscribed in stone. Scattered across the world are other objects that defy easy categorization. Crystal skulls of Mesoamerica, carved with precision that baffles even modern diamond tools. Ancient batteries in Mesopotamia, clay jars with copper and iron inserts, which when filled with acidic liquid can produce an electric charge. Maps such as the Piri Reis chart of 1513, which appears to depict coastlines of Antarctica long before the continent was officially discovered, and even shows them free of ice, as they would have appeared thousands of years ago. Each artifact alone may be explained as coincidence, fraud, or curiosity. But taken together, they form a constellation of anomalies pointing toward one haunting possibility. Fragments of advanced knowledge once existed, scattered like stars in the darkness of history. Even Sumer, the so-called first civilization, emerges into history with knowledge fully formed: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law. How is it that humanity's first step looked more like the 50th? Where did this knowledge come from? The Sumerians themselves answered plainly. It was given by the gods, the Apkallu, the sages who rose from the waters after the flood. To modern ears, this sounds like myth. But perhaps it is memory. Perhaps their gods were the survivors of a world drowned, passing down fragments of knowledge they themselves only barely remembered. What if the Antikythera mechanism is a descendant of devices older than Greece, salvaged from a drowned library? What if the Dendera light is the symbolic echo of technologies remembered only in myth? What if the Piri race map was not a miracle of 16th century navigation, but a copy of copies, an inheritance from cartographers who lived before the seas rose? These are not answers, but questions that press against the edges of our understanding. They remind us that history is not a neat line, but a palimpsest. Stories written over stories, knowledge layered over memory, fragments carried across the flood like seeds in an ark. Skeptics argue that anomalies are inevitable in a record as vast as human history, that each of these objects can be explained by ingenuity, coincidence, or error. And perhaps they are right. But the weight of pattern grows heavier with each discovery. It is not one artifact, but many. Not one myth, but hundreds. Not one site, but a global scattering of ruins, each whispering the same message. Something came before, something advanced, something powerful, something forgotten. And here lies the irony. The flood that destroyed may also have preserved. In burying cities beneath silt and stone, it may have sealed artifacts in the earth, waiting for us to uncover them. In scattering survivors, it may have planted seeds of memory that sprouted into myths and symbols. In destroying a world, it ensured that pieces of it would survive just long enough to haunt the next. When we hold the Antikythera mechanism, when we study the Dendera carving, when we trace the impossible coastlines of the Piri race map, we are not just looking at objects, we are touching fragments of a drowned memory. They are echoes from before the flood, speaking to us in gears, in glyphs, in lines drawn on vellum. They remind us that we are not the first to gaze at the stars, to measure the heavens, to dream of power harnessed and knowledge preserved. We are only the latest, and perhaps one day we too will be remembered not as originators, but as fragments, our story whispered in the myths of those who come after. The earth has always been a storyteller. Its language is stone, its script carved into valleys, cliffs, and seabeds. Unlike myths, which can be reimagined, or artifacts, which can be doubted, geology whispers with a voice far older and harder to deny. And when we listen closely, the earth itself seems to confirm what the flood myths have always claimed, that the planet once endured cataclysms so violent they reshaped entire continents, drowning the memory of worlds before our own. Consider the channeled scablands of Washington State. At first glance, they look like the aftermath of a war between titans, valleys too broad for their rivers, boulders the size of houses scattered like children's toys, ripple marks in solid basalt as tall as buildings. For decades, geologists could not explain them. Slow erosion could not account for such violence. It was J. Harlan Bretz who first proposed in the 1920s that the scablands were carved not by rivers, but by a flood, an unimaginably massive deluge unleashed when glacial dams burst at the end of the Ice Age. His colleagues laughed. Catastrophes were out of fashion in science. But evidence mounted, and eventually Bretz was vindicated. The scablands were the scars of a mega-flood, water moving at 60 miles per hour, walls hundreds of feet high. It was not erosion over millennia, but destruction in days. If such a flood could transform the Pacific Northwest, what else might it have erased? Some argue the Missoula floods were local, tied to the collapse of an ice dam, but researchers like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson suggest they may be part of a broader pattern, fragments of a global catastrophe remembered as the Great Flood. The scablands, in their view, are not isolated scars, but one piece of a planetary event. A deluge that drowned cities as easily as it scoured valleys. The Black Sea tells another tale. Around 7,500 years ago, rising sea levels breached the Bosporus, flooding what had once been a freshwater lake and turning it into the saltwater sea we know today. Archaeologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that this event may have inspired flood myths of the Near East, including the biblical story of Noah. To the people living on its shores, the flood would have been apocalyptic. Water swallowing villages, farmland, and sacred places within days. Survivors would have carried the memory forward, retelling it as divine judgment. The Black Sea, then, becomes not just a body of water, but a monument to memory. A geological record of catastrophe transformed into scripture. Farther east, the Gulf of Cambay off India reveals evidence of sudden inundation. As sonar mapping uncovered possible city ruins, geologists noted that the seabed itself bore signs of rapid flooding, consistent with the Younger Dryas, a period of violent climate change around 12,800 years ago. If these ruins are real, they would not stand alone, but among countless others swallowed by the seas that rose when glaciers melted. It was not a slow drowning, but a surge, the kind of flood that myths describe with awe and terror. Even the Gulf of Mexico may hold secrets of the flood. Some researchers point to strange sedimentary layers and buried impact craters as evidence of comet fragments striking during the Younger Dryas, triggering rapid ice melt and massive floods. If true, then the flood was not simply water, but fire and water combined, a cosmic impact igniting a planetary reset. To survivors, it would have felt like the wrath of the heavens themselves, a judgment both fiery and watery, too vast to explain, except as the anger of gods. The Earth's landscapes repeat the story in countless places. In Siberia, massive boulders lie scattered as if tossed by waves. In the Mediterranean, sunken valleys suggest sudden inundation. In North America, giant glacial erratics, boulders transported hundreds of miles, sit in fields, mute reminders of torrents that carried them. Everywhere we look, we find scars too large for ordinary processes, too violent for gradual time. These scars align with what myth remembers, a flood that erased not just rivers but worlds. The significance of these geological stories is not only in their scale, but in their timing. Many of them converge around the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago. It is the same moment Göbekli Tepe was built, the same moment myths place the Great Deluge. Coincidence, perhaps, or confirmation that the memory encoded in stone and story is the same memory, seen from two different perspectives. To the Earth, it was the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate collapse. To humanity, it was the Great Flood, the day the world ended. What makes this chilling is not only the violence of the past, but its implications for the present. If the flood was real, if the Earth has endured sudden global catastrophes before, then our civilization is not immune. We build our cities on coastlines, just as those who came before us did. We rely on stable climates, just as they did. But history, both geological and mythological, warns us that stability is an illusion. Seas can rise, skies can burn, ice can collapse. The flood myths may not just be records of the past, but warnings for the future. When we walk across the Scablands, or sail over the Black Sea, or dive in the Gulf of Cambay, we are not just exploring geology. We are touching the edges of a memory older than writing, a memory etched into Earth itself. These places are not anomalies. They are the Earth's testimony. They tell us that the Great Flood was no fantasy, no moral allegory, but a scar of reality. They tell us that entire landscapes can vanish in days, that civilizations can be erased in hours, and that the ocean, patient and merciless, always waits. And perhaps this is why the flood stories endure. They are not just history, but survival guides, cultural reminders of a truth too terrible to forget, that the earth can and will wipe the slate clean. To deny this is to ignore the language of stone, the voice of valleys carved by torrents, the silence of ruins buried in silt. The flood was real, the earth remembers, and if we listen carefully, so do we. If the flood was real, then the question of who it destroyed becomes far more unsettling. Myths from nearly every culture speak not only of humans and animals, but of beings who were different, larger, stronger, sometimes divine, sometimes monstrous. The Bible calls them the Nephilim, the giants who walked the earth before the deluge. In other lands they appear as titans, Anunnaki, or the great ones whose bones now lie hidden in the earth. Could these be distortions of memory, fragments of what was lost? Or were they inventions to explain the unimaginable ruins left behind? In the book of Genesis, the Nephilim appear briefly but powerfully. There were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men of old, men of renown. They are linked to corruption, to violence, to the moment when the divine decided to cleanse the earth with water. To some, this is metaphor, stories of moral decay, but to others it is history in disguise, the record of beings who once walked alongside humanity, perhaps even ruled us. The flood becomes not merely a punishment, but an act of erasure, sweeping away a race that stood as rivals or rulers before human history began anew. In Greek mythology, the Titans were overthrown by the Olympian gods in a war of cataclysm. The echoes are striking. Giants who challenged order, cast down in a destruction so vast it became legend. In Norse tales, the Jotun, or frost giants, stood against the gods, and Ragnarok, the end of the world, was described as a flood of fire and water combined. Across the Americas, indigenous peoples tell of giants who roamed the land before being wiped away by floods or lightning. In each culture, the story is the same. The world before ours was not only different, it was inhabited by beings greater than ourselves, swept away in disaster so that humanity could rise. Archaeological whispers add fuel to the myth. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers in North America reported the discovery of enormous skeletons in burial mounds, bones said to belong to men 8 or 9 feet tall. Most of these reports faded into obscurity, dismissed as exaggerations or hoaxes, yet they reflect a widespread cultural fascination. Even today, oversized bones occasionally surface, though usually explained as prehistoric animals misidentified. Still, the persistence of the idea raises questions. Why do so many myths, scattered and isolated, remember giants? Why do they so often link their downfall to floods? Perhaps these giants were not literal beings of impossible stature, but symbolic representations of civilizations whose scale dwarfed the survivors. Imagine living among ruins you could not explain, walls of stones taller than a man, temples aligned with stars you could not track, foundations built with blocks so massive they seemed beyond human strength. To the inheritors of such ruins, it would be natural to say they were made by giants. Over generations, the story would harden into legend, Before us there were beings of immense size, and the flood destroyed them. Yet some myths resist such metaphor. The Sumerian spoke of the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens, taught humanity, and interbred with mortals. The result, some stories suggest, were hybrid beings, neither wholly human nor wholly divine. In Genesis, the Nephilim may be exactly that, sons of God, mingling with the daughters of men, producing a race that provoked the wrath of heaven. If so, then the flood was less about moral cleansing and more about biological reset, the removal of a people who were not meant to endure. There are echoes even in the stones. At Baalbek, the trilithon blocks are so massive that later generations called them the work of giants. In Cusco, walls of interlocking stones are said by the Inca to have been built by beings of immense strength. In Easter Island, the Rapa Nui spoke of the Moai walking into place, moved by power beyond ordinary men. Again and again, the myth of giants overlays the mystery of megaliths, as if humanity sought to explain the inexplicable with the simplest answer. Those who built these things must have been larger than us. But what if giant meant more than size? What if it meant stature, intellectual, technological, or spiritual stature? Survivors of a drowned world, carrying knowledge and skill so immense it seemed superhuman, could easily become giants in the eyes of those who inherited their ruins. Their downfall in the flood would then become part of the cycle of destruction, remembered in myth as the cleansing of giants, the removal of those too powerful or too corrupted to remain. This perspective reframes the flood as more than an act of nature. It becomes a reset of balance. Humanity, small and scattered, inherits the earth not because we were the first, but because we were the last to survive. Giants, whether literal or metaphorical, were erased so that a new world could begin. Their memory lingers only in myths, in whispers of Nephilim, Titans, Anunnaki, frost giants, beings too powerful to endure. And perhaps this is why the story of giants persists. It is not a fantasy, but a cultural memory of something lost. Whether they were actual beings or symbols for civilizations greater than our own, the giants remind us that we walk upon the ruins of those who came before. The flood swept them away, but it could not sweep away their memory. That memory endures in scripture, in folklore, in ruins too massive for ordinary men. It endures as a warning that greatness is fragile, that power can provoke destruction, and that no civilization, however immense, is safe from the waters. If the Great Flood was the line between two worlds, then the giants were its victims, erased so completely that only stories remain. Yet in those stories, a truth lingers like a shadow. Humanity is not alone in the tale of intelligence. Others came before, others built, others fell. And their echoes remind us that history is not just our story. It is the story of the earth itself, repeating in cycles, washing giants into myth, and leaving us to wonder what else lies forgotten beneath the tides. When Plato described Atlantis, he spoke of a mighty island nation that ruled the seas, its fleets stretching across oceans, its cities laid out in concentric rings of canals and temples. In one terrible night, he said, Atlantis sank beneath the waves and was lost forever. For centuries, the story had been debated. Was it allegory, political parable, or memory of a real catastrophe? Skeptics point out that no conclusive ruins have been found. Yet when we look across the world, we find whispers of Atlantis everywhere, drowned cities, submerged temples, ruins lying beneath the sea, as if waiting for the myth to catch up with reality. Off the coast of Cuba in 2001, sonar scans revealed vast geometric patterns on the seabed. Explorers described streets, avenues, even pyramidal shapes lying beneath 600 meters of water. If these are natural formations, they are uncanny. If they are artificial, then they belong to a time when sea levels were dramatically lower, at least 12,000 years ago, during the last ice age. The discovery was quietly shelved, dismissed by some as sonar illusions. But the images remain, haunting in their regularity, suggesting a city so vast it could rewrite everything we know about prehistory. In the Bahamas, divers swim above the Bimini Road, a line of massive rectangular stones stretching for nearly half a mile beneath shallow water. Skeptics call it beach rock fractured by tides, yet the alignment is too straight, the blocks too regular. To believers, it is a causeway, the last trace of a drowned culture, perhaps even part of the legendary Atlantis. When Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, predicted in the 1930s that Atlantis would be found near Bimini, it was dismissed as mysticism. Yet when divers later found the stone formations, even science had to admit the coincidence was uncanny. Egypt, too, hides its own Atlantean echoes. In 2000, French divers uncovered the ruins of Heracleion and Canopus, ancient port cities swallowed by the Mediterranean over 1,000 years ago. Columns, statues, temples, even shipwrecks lay buried under silt, astonishingly preserved. These are not as old as Atlantis, but they serve as a reminder. Great cities can and do sink, taking their histories with them. If relatively recent cities could vanish so completely, why not older ones? Cities built in the dawn of time, when seas rose and the world reset. Legends also point us eastward, to India's Dwarka, said to have been ruled by Krishna before it was consumed by the sea. For centuries, Dwarka was myth, like Atlantis, until divers found ruins beneath the Gulf of Kambat, stone walls, streets, artifacts, all lying where the stories said the city once stood. In Japan, Yonaguni tells the same tale: monolithic stairways and platforms beneath the waves, too precise for mere geology. Around the world, the story repeats itself, not once or twice, but dozens of times. Drowned ruins where myths say cities once thrived. What emerges from these discoveries is a pattern not of isolated anomalies, but of a global network. If ruins lie beneath the waters of India, Japan, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Egypt, then perhaps they were once part of a civilization whose reach spanned oceans. This was not a scattered collection of villages, but something greater, something interconnected. Survivors of the flood remembered it as Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria, giving different names to the same lost world. Each culture told the story in its own tongue, but all carried the same core. There was once a civilization of immense power, and it was destroyed in a single catastrophe. Geologists remind us that sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, swallowing coastlines that had been home to humanity for tens of thousands of years. More than 20 million square kilometers of habitable land now lies underwater. Land that would have been prime real estate for ancient cities. If human civilization existed before the flood, most of its traces would now be beneath the waves, beyond easy reach. The ruins we have found may be only the beginning, fragments of a vast drowned archive still hidden beneath the seas. And if those ruins were once connected, if Cuba's geometric structures, Bimini's causeway, Yonaguni's platforms, and Dwarka's streets were all part of a global network, then the flood did not just destroy a city, but a world system. Imagine a civilization with ports on every ocean, its knowledge spread across continents. Imagine its fall in days, its ships tossed onto mountains, its cities drowned, its survivors scattered. To those who lived through it, it would have felt as though the entire planet had turned against them. To their descendants, the story would have become legend, a memory of a world that fell in one night of water. This raises a question rarely asked. What if the flood was not only destruction, but concealment? When seas rose, they did not just wash away, they buried. They entombed cities in silence, sealing them beneath sediment, protecting them from the eyes of future generations until we were ready to find them. The ocean becomes not only the grave of Atlantis, but its library, keeping its secrets until we learn how to read them. And yet, even with sonar, satellites, and submarines, we have barely begun to search. Less than 5% of the ocean floor has been explored in detail. What lies hidden in the other 95%? What ruins rest in trenches, on continental shelves, beneath layers of silt so thick we may never uncover them? Each discovery, Cambay, Yonaguni, Bimini, Heracleion, is a whisper. The full story remains locked away, deeper than our technology has yet reached. Still, the pattern is clear. The Great Flood was not local. It was global. It erased not just one Atlantis, but many Atlantean cities, each with its own name, its own story, its own survivors. The myth of Atlantis, then, is not the tale of a single lost island, but of an entire world swept away. When Plato spoke of Atlantis, he may have been speaking not of one memory, but of a memory shared by humanity itself. The memory of a time before the flood, when the earth was home to civilizations far older than we allow ourselves to imagine. To stand on the shore today and look at the horizon is to look upon the grave of those worlds. Beneath the calm blue lies a silence deeper than stone, the silence of cities waiting to be remembered. The flood erased them, but it did not destroy them completely. They are there, sleeping, waiting for us to dive deeper, to listen closer, to admit that our story is not the first chapter, but perhaps only the second. Civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge has a way of lingering like smoke after fire. Even when cities vanish, fragments of what they knew can survive. Encoded in myths, etched in stone, hidden in symbols, or passed down in traditions whose origins have long been forgotten. When we look at the earliest cultures after the supposed Great Flood, we find something strange. They emerge not as fumbling beginners, but as fully formed societies, armed with advanced mathematics, precise astronomy, and myths filled with technical metaphors. It is as if they inherited rather than invented, as if they carried forward remnants of sciences older than history itself. Take the Sumerians, often credited as the first civilization. When they appear in the historical record around 5,000 years ago, they already have cuneiform writing, complex law codes, a detailed understanding of astronomy, and a sexagesimal number system still embedded in our modern use of 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. How does the first civilization begin with advanced astronomy? Their records describe planetary movements, eclipses, and even references to planets not visible to the naked eye. They claimed this knowledge came from the Apkallu. the sages who rose from the waters after the flood. To us, it sounds mythological, but to them, it was memory. Egypt, too, emerges with mysteries. Its earliest dynasties already knew how to align massive monuments with solstices and star systems. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy rivaling modern instruments. Its proportions encode mathematical constants like pi and phi, whether intentionally or by coincidence. On the ceilings of temples such as Dendera, zodiacal maps chart constellations in complex patterns. These are not the fumbling steps of a people learning the sky. They are the confident strokes of a culture that inherited advanced astronomical traditions. Egyptian priests themselves spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, when knowledge was handed down from a prior age. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked Venus with such precision that their calendar could predict its movements centuries into the future. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Columbian manuscripts, contains tables of eclipses and planetary cycles rivaling modern calculations. The Maya said their knowledge came from the gods, particularly Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who arrived after a flood to teach humanity. Once again, the story aligns. Survivors, bearers of fragments, remembered not as refugees but as gods. Even the Polynesians, navigating the vast Pacific in canoes, demonstrated mastery of astronomy, ocean currents, and bird migrations so precise that modern sailors still struggle to replicate it without instruments. Their oral traditions speak of knowledge passed down by ancestors who came from islands that sank beneath the sea. For them, the stars were not only guides but maps of memory, linking their voyages to a time when the ocean itself rose and remade the world. But knowledge was not confined to the heavens. Ancient myths also describe lost sciences of energy and power. In the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, some see depictions resembling arc lamps or vacuum tubes, suggesting symbolic memories of harnessing light. In India's Vedic texts, there are descriptions of vimanas, flying chariots propelled by energies modern readers interpret as mechanical or electrical. At Tiwanaku in Bolivia, monolithic carvings may encode solar cycles and resonance patterns, hinting at a science of sound and vibration. None of this can be proved, yet the persistence of such imagery across cultures raises a haunting question. Are these metaphors, or are they echoes of technologies once known and then forgotten? One of the most enigmatic relics is the Antikythera mechanism, found in a Greek shipwreck and dated to over 2,000 years ago. It is a mechanical computer capable of predicting eclipses and planetary alignments with breathtaking precision. Mainstream scholars call it an isolated genius of Greek invention. But what if it is not an origin, but a survival? One of many devices based on designs far older, preserved and replicated long after the flood destroyed their original creators? In that sense, the mechanism is not just an artifact but a messenger, carrying forward the ghost of a science long lost. The persistence of sacred numbers across cultures also hints at an inherited system. 60, 360, 108, numbers revered in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and beyond. Were these coincidences, or the remnants of a unified system of measurement and cosmology carried from a drowned world? Even today, we find these numbers encoded in architecture, from Angkor Wat in Cambodia to Stonehenge in England. The recurrence is too consistent to ignore. The irony is that mainstream history portrays these civilizations as beginnings, first steps of human brilliance. But beginnings should be clumsy, experimental, uneven. Instead, they appear polished, confident, even overqualified for their time. Sumerians who already know the stars, Egyptians who already master alignments, Maya who already track Venus, Polynesians who already map an ocean the size of half the globe. These are not beginnings. These are inheritances. They suggest that the flood did not erase everything, that fragments of knowledge floated above the waters, carried by survivors who spread across the globe. Over generations, fragments became traditions. Astronomy was preserved as myth of gods and constellations. Mathematics was sanctified as sacred numbers. Energy was remembered as divine light or thunderbolts of gods. Each culture reimagined what it could not fully understand, transforming science into myth. Yet behind the myths lies the same heartbeat, memory of a world that came before. If this is true, then humanity has been rebuilding, not inventing. We are not the pioneers of knowledge, but the restorers of it, rediscovering pieces of a puzzle that was shattered long ago. The flood erased the picture, but fragments survived, and we have been trying ever since to put them back together. Perhaps that is why our science feels so familiar, as if we are not inventing, but remembering. The Great Flood then becomes not only a story of destruction, but of transmission. It drowned the cities, but it could not drown memory. Survivors carried the knowledge of the heavens, the sacred numbers, the seeds of mathematics and myth. They gave them to their children, who gave them to theirs, until they appeared in Sumer, in Egypt, in Maya codices, in Polynesian navigation. The flood was both an end and a beginning, a severing of continuity, yet also the scattering of sparks that would one day ignite again. And those sparks still burn. In every anomaly, in every inexplicable artifact, in every myth of gods who brought wisdom, we find traces of the same truth. Knowledge is older than history. It did not begin with us. It survived the waters. And if we dare to listen, it tells us that the flood did not erase everything. It left us fragments, enough to remind us that we are not the first to know, only the first to forget. When a civilization faces destruction, its greatest fear is not death, but forgetting. To be washed away without leaving a trace is to vanish twice, once in the body and again in the memory. If the Great Flood truly ended a world older than ours, then the survivors may have carried not only fragments of knowledge, but also the burden of remembrance. They may have carved their warnings into stone, encoded them in myth, and aligned their monuments with the heavens in the hope that one day when the earth reset again, someone would notice. And perhaps we already walk among those messages without realizing it. Across the globe, ancient monuments display alignments so precise they seem less like chance and more like intent. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented almost perfectly to true north, its sides aligning with cardinal directions to an error of only a fraction of a degree. At Stonehenge, solstices and equinoxes are marked by the rising and setting of the sun through massive stone gates. In Mexico, the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza casts a serpent-shaped shadow during the equinox, a living glyph carved from light and stone. These alignments served practical purposes, marking agricultural cycles, but they also feel like signals, warnings encoded in architecture, reminders that the heavens themselves can tell us when cycles of destruction are near. Why would ancient builders go to such lengths to encode astronomy in stone? perhaps because they knew that time erases everything except the stars. Myths fade, languages die, empires collapse, but the constellations return night after night, unchanged for millennia. To survivors of a flood, the stars may have been the only constant, a cosmic clock immune to water's erasure. By aligning their monuments with celestial events, they left behind calendars, warnings, and messages that could outlive memory itself. We see the same impulse in myths that describe cycles of time. The Maya spoke of suns, ages of the world destroyed by water, fire, and earth, each ending in cataclysm before a new one began. The Hindus describe yugas, cycles of creation and destruction spanning thousands of years, each ending with dissolution and renewal. The Greeks told of ages, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each falling into ruin before the cycle restarted. What if these myths are not allegories, but records? What if survivors encoded the flood not only in stone, but in story, teaching their children that worlds rise and fall, that catastrophes return, and that survival depends on remembering? Symbols repeat across cultures, suggesting a language older than any tongue. The serpent, winding and coiled, appears as a bringer of knowledge in Mesoamerica, as the Kundalini force in India, as the Ouroboros devouring its own tail in Egypt and Greece. The serpent is change, cycle, renewal, an ancient warning carved into myth. Likewise, the flood itself is remembered not as one event, but as a pattern. Again and again, myths insist. The world ends in water, and the world begins again. It is less a story than a system, less history than prophecy. Some researchers believe even numbers carry warnings. The repetition of sacred constants, 108 in Hindu cosmology, 360 in Mesopotamia, 12 and 72 in Egypt, may be more than religious fixation. They correspond to astronomical cycles, the precession of the equinoxes, the shifting of stars across millennia, a cosmic clock ticking toward catastrophe. Survivors of a flood may have encoded these numbers into temples and myths to remind us that time itself contains patterns of destruction. When the cycle repeats, we are supposed to remember. The notion of encoded warnings is unsettling because it suggests intentionality. It suggests that survivors of the Great Flood were not only fleeing death, but thinking of us, those who would come after. They may have known that the earth resets itself, that cataclysms return, and that future civilizations would need guidance. By carving messages into monuments and embedding them in myths, they tried to ensure we would not be caught unaware. Yet have we listened? Or have we dismissed their voices as superstition? Consider Göbekli Tepe once more. Its carvings include animals and abstract symbols, some of which researchers argue are constellations, possibly recording a comet impact around 10,800 BCE, an event that could have triggered the Younger Dryas, melting glaciers and unleashing floods. If true, Göbekli Tepe is not just a temple, but a warning marker, a memory of destruction encoded in stone. The very act of burying the site deliberately, as evidence suggests, may itself have been an attempt at preservation, a time capsule for a future humanity. The Great Pyramid, too, has been argued to encode more than tombs. Its dimensions reflect astronomical ratios, its shafts align with Orion's belt and Sirius, its proportions seem to contain mathematical constants. Are these coincidences or intentional messages? To us, they are mysteries, but to survivors they may have been necessities, an attempt to pass down not just shelter, but knowledge, compressed into geometry, waiting for rediscovery. And what of myths that speak of fire from the sky, of gods hurling thunderbolts, of floods unleashed by celestial anger? To modern ears, they are colorful stories. But to survivors of comet impacts or glacial collapses, they may have been coded memory, simplified into story so children would not forget. If the cycle repeats, the myth would serve as a survival manual disguised as legend. The tragedy is that we have often dismissed these warnings. We have treated myths as superstition, ruins as curiosities, alignments as accidents. Yet beneath our feet, the earth keeps its own records, and they agree with the stories. Floods have come before, catastrophes have wiped out worlds, and if cycles of astronomy and geology are true, they may come again. The survivors of the flood may have tried to tell us this. They may have screamed across millennia in stone and story, hoping we would listen. To walk among ancient ruins, then, is not only to marvel, but to read. Each block, each alignment, each glyph is part of a message that transcends time. We were here. We endured destruction. Remember what we could not keep. The Great Flood may have erased their cities, but not their warnings. They are everywhere if we learn how to see them. When we place the fragments together, the submerged cities, the impossible megaliths, the encoded warnings in myth and stone, a larger picture begins to emerge. It is not the picture of isolated cultures inventing themselves in splendid isolation, but of something more connected, more unified. A web of knowledge stretching across oceans, a network that once spanned continents before the flood erased its name. We call its fragments Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, Zep-Tepi. But perhaps these are only local names for what was truly global, a civilization whose reach we are only beginning to glimpse. Evidence for such a network lies in the uncanny similarities found across distant cultures. The pyramids of Egypt rise in the desert sands, while half a world away, step pyramids stand in Mexico, Cambodia, and Indonesia. Mainstream archaeology explains these as parallel evolution, different societies arriving at similar shapes for practical reasons. But the similarities go deeper. The alignment of pyramids with cardinal directions, the use of sacred numbers, the incorporation of astronomical cycles. These patterns repeat across oceans as if guided by a common template. Were they inventions or memories? Survivors of a global flood, scattered to every shore, may have carried fragments of architecture, cosmology, and mathematics with them, planting the same seeds in distant soils. Consider the serpent. In Egypt, it coils as the Ouroboros, symbol of eternity. In Mesoamerica, it is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who brings knowledge. In India, it rises as the Kundalini energy, coiled at the base of the spine. In Norse myth, Jormungandr encircles the world, destined to rise in Ragnarok. The serpent is everywhere, slithering across continents, carrying the same meanings of cycles, power, knowledge, destruction, and renewal. How does a symbol become so universal if not carried outward from a shared source? The same can be said for the flood itself. Over 200 cultures preserve nearly identical stories: divine warning, chosen survivors, a vessel or mountain refuge, animals preserved, the world remade. These are not isolated coincidences, but echoes of a single trauma, scattered like seeds after a storm. If the flood was global, then survivors in every corner of the earth would have carried the same story, told in their own language but preserving the same structure. In that sense, the flood myth itself is evidence of a global network, of human memory stretched across continents, bound by a shared catastrophe. Even architecture carries the whisper of unity. The massive stones of Sacsayhuaman in Peru interlock without mortar, just as the blocks of the Osirian in Egypt or the foundations of Baalbek in Lebanon. The trilithons of Stonehenge echo the post and lintel design seen in temples across Asia. The use of acoustics, chambers resonating with chants, walls amplifying voices, appears from Chichen Itza to Newgrange in Ireland. It is as though builders across the world shared not just similar ideas, but a common science of sound, stone, and star. Maps, too, provide tantalizing hints. The Piri Reis map of 1513, based on older sources, shows the coast of South America and even Antarctica with startling accuracy. If the underlying charts truly date back thousands of years, then they imply a global knowledge of navigation long before Columbus or Magellan. How could such accuracy exist unless inherited from a seafaring culture that spanned oceans before the flood swallowed its ports? Critics argue that diffusionist theories, ideas of a single source for global culture, underestimate human ingenuity. They point out that humans everywhere looked up at the same stars, saw the same cycles of sun and moon, faced the same needs of shelter, food, and order. Similarities, they say, are inevitable. But the counter-argument is simple. Why do the similarities go beyond function into the realm of symbolism, mythology, and sacred numbers? Why does the number 12 govern zodiacal systems in both Mesopotamia and China? Why do flood myths preserve identical details from the Americas to Australia? Why do pyramid cultures not only build similar shapes, but also align them with solstices and equinoxes? Parallel invention explains part of the story, but inheritance explains it better. If we imagine a pre-flood civilization with global reach, the puzzle begins to make sense. Such a civilization may not have been industrial in our sense, no smokestacks, no factories, but advanced in other ways: stonework, astronomy, energy, seafaring. It may have built networks of cities along coastlines, hubs of trade and knowledge that connected the world. When the flood came, those coastlines drowned, the cities vanished, and the survivors scattered inland. They carried fragments of their world, symbols, myths, building techniques, and planted them wherever they settled. Over generations, the fragments evolved into local traditions, diverging but still bearing the unmistakable fingerprints of their origin. This theory reframes the flood not just as a catastrophe, but as a dispersal. The flood scattered the seeds of civilization across the world, ensuring its memory survived even as its body drowned. Survivors became culture bearers, remembered as gods, sages, or giants. Their ruins became sacred sites, their knowledge transmuted into myth. The global civilization itself vanished, but its echoes spread everywhere, so deeply embedded in human culture that we still feel them today. And perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps the survivors knew their world was gone, but sought to preserve its essence. By encoding astronomy in stone, by sanctifying numbers, by embedding cycles of time into myth, they ensured that even if names and cities were lost, the knowledge would remain. If future civilizations arose, they would find the fragments and, piece by piece, reconstruct what had been forgotten. In this way, the pre-flood network still lives, not in ruins or artifacts, but in the very foundations of every culture that came after. Standing at the pyramids of Giza, or walking the steps of Chichen Itza, or listening to the serpent myths of India and Mexico, one cannot help but feel that thread, a golden chain linking continents, a memory of unity before the waters rose. The flood did not erase it entirely. It scattered it like stars across the sky, waiting for us to trace the constellations and see the picture whole again. Every great trauma leaves its mark not only on the body but on the mind. If the Great Flood was real, if it swept away entire worlds and left only scattered survivors clinging to mountains and memories, then its deepest impact may not have been the ruins it left behind, but the fear it engraved into the human soul. When we sift through myths, when we listen to the voices of ancient peoples, we find not only accounts of survival, but a lingering dread, a conviction that the gods can destroy the world at any time, and that paradise, once lost, will never fully return. In the Bible, the flood becomes a story of divine punishment. Humanity's wickedness provoked God, who unleashed the waters to cleanse the earth. Only Noah and his family were spared, chosen not for their strength, but for their righteousness. The trauma of the flood is reframed as morality, a lesson that obedience is the only safeguard against annihilation. To the survivors, this reframing made sense. When nature itself turned hostile, when the skies poured for 40 days and nights, when the sea rose to swallow the land, it must have felt like judgment. To find meaning in the chaos, they imagined a moral cause. Humanity had sinned, and the gods had washed it away. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, warned by the gods of a coming deluge. He builds a massive boat, saves his family and animals, and survives as the rest of the world drowns. Here again, survival depends on favor from the divine, on being chosen. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish god of a flood and is carried to safety in a vessel, later tasked with repopulating the earth. In each case, the flood is remembered as both catastrophe and covenant, destruction and renewal, but always tinged with fear. The gods hold the power to wipe the slate clean, and humanity lives only at their mercy. This fear becomes embedded in culture, shaping how people saw the world and their place in it. Agricultural societies built rituals to appease the heavens, sacrifices to hold back chaos, prayers to calm the waters. Storms, floods, and droughts were no longer natural events. They were omens, reminders that annihilation could return at any moment. Humanity, still haunted by the memory of a real flood, lived with the expectation of punishment. Catastrophe was no longer an accident of nature, but a warning from above. At the same time, myths of paradise arose, memories of a world before the flood, a golden age when gods walked among men, when knowledge flowed freely, when harmony reigned. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time. The Greeks spoke of the golden age, when men lived like gods, free from toil and sorrow, until it ended in flood and fire. The Hebrews remembered Eden, a garden from which humanity was cast out, unable to return. In every culture, there is a story of something better lost, something pure drowned, something perfect destroyed by forces beyond control. These are not just myths of beginnings. They are myths of mourning. They are the grief of survivors encoded into memory. This dual inheritance, fear of divine punishment and longing for lost paradise, shaped civilizations for millennia. Temples became both sanctuaries and fortresses against chaos, places where humans could connect with the divine and plead for mercy. Ritual calendars were built around the cycles of water and sky, desperate attempts to predict or forestall disaster. Kings and priests claimed their authority from the gods, positioning themselves as mediators who could protect society from another deluge. The very structures of religion and power may have been built atop the psychological scar left by the flood. And yet, trauma is not only fear, but also drive. Survivors of the flood may have been haunted by what they lost, but they were also motivated to rebuild, to reclaim fragments of the past. Myths of lost paradise were not only laments but goals, dreams of what could be restored. Civilizations chased the memory of the Golden Age in their art, their architecture, their sciences. Every temple aligned with the stars, every monument carved in stone, was an attempt to recreate a world destroyed, to stitch paradise back together from the shards left behind. Even today, echoes of this longing persist. Our fascination with utopias, with perfect societies, with science that promises to restore what we lack, is the same impulse that drove ancient peoples to build pyramids, ziggurats, and megaliths. We inherit their grief without realizing it, living under the shadow of a catastrophe too ancient to remember directly, but too vast to forget completely. We fear global destruction, whether by flood, fire, or cosmic impact, because deep inside we know it has happened before. Perhaps this is why the flood story endures. It is more than history, more than geology. It is psychology. It explains not only why we build and remember, but why we fear and dream. It is the wound beneath our myths, the hidden trauma passed from one generation to the next. The survivors may have carried seeds and tools, but what they truly carried was memory. Memory of loss, memory of punishment, memory of paradise. And that memory became the foundation of civilization itself. The Great Flood, then, is not only a story of water, it is a story of the human soul. It tells us why we fear the wrath of gods, why we long for a world before corruption, why we build monuments to eternity, and why we are never satisfied with the present. The flood drowned the past, but it also shaped the future, leaving humanity forever caught between dread of destruction and yearning for what was lost. Beneath the dust of time, under the foundations of temples and palaces, there is a pattern too strange to ignore. Archaeology often presents history as a steady climb, from stone tools to villages, from villages to cities, from cities to empires. Yet, when we look closely at the ruins scattered across the world, we find a different story. Again and again, the deeper we dig, the older the stone, the larger the blocks, the tighter the fits, the more advanced the construction. On top, we see refinement and art. Below, we see power and precision, monuments that defy the capabilities of the cultures to which they are usually credited. It is as if survivors of a lost civilization built foundations with knowledge they could not preserve, and later peoples merely built upon their bones. Take Egypt. Visitors are often awed by the temples of Luxor or Karnak, but at Abydos lies something stranger, the Osirion. Unlike the ornate, inscribed halls of later dynasties, the Osirion is stark, built from massive granite blocks set in Cyclopean style, its floor sunk deep beneath the water table. It feels less like a temple and more like a bunker, heavy and silent, out of step with the architecture above it. Egyptologists insist it belongs to the reign of Seti IV, yet its megalithic style resembles nothing else from that period. To some, it is evidence of inheritance, The pharaohs added their temples atop foundations left from a far older age, one whose builders knew techniques later Egyptians did not. In Lebanon, the temple complex of Baalbek tells the same tale. The Romans claimed the grand colonnades, but beneath them lies the trilithon, 3 stones, each over 800 tons, fitted together with such precision that their seams are invisible. No Roman text describes their placement. No surviving technology explains their transport. In the quarry nearby rests the stone of the pregnant woman, weighing over 1,000 tons, abandoned as though the builders vanished before finishing their task. The Romans built atop the foundation, but the foundation itself whispers of a past older, more powerful, and erased. Across the ocean in Peru, Sacsayhuaman crowns a hill above Cusco. Its walls, made of immense polygonal stones, interlock with such accuracy that centuries of earthquakes have failed to move them. The Inca revered the site but admitted they did not build it. They said it was the work of the Viracochas, giants, gods, or ancestors who came before. Even today, the scale of the lower walls dwarfs the refined but smaller masonry laid by the Inca above them. The same is true at Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu, where older foundations of massive blocks support later, more delicate constructions. The deeper one looks, the stronger and stranger the stone becomes. Bolivia's Puma Punku is perhaps the most dramatic anomaly. Its scattered blocks, carved with machine-like precision, feature right angles, grooves, and interlocking shapes, as though they were components of a vast three-dimensional puzzle. They lie strewn across the plateau, damaged as if by catastrophe, but still radiating the aura of advanced design. Archaeologists credit the Tiwanaku culture with their construction, yet Tiwanaku itself shows simpler, rougher work above. How could the same people produce both impossibly perfect stonework and clumsier walls in the same place? The simplest explanation is that they didn't. They inherited ruins, repurposed them, and added their own structures on top. This pattern repeats globally. In Japan, beneath the city of Asuka, there are megalithic carvings like the Masuda no Iwafune, a granite block weighing hundreds of tons, shaped with sharp precision but serving no obvious purpose. In Cambodia, Angkor Wat dazzles with its artistry, yet beneath it lies evidence of older structures aligned with solstices and stars. In Turkey, beneath Byzantine layers, lie older foundations whose stones are larger and more enigmatic. Everywhere, the story is the same. Newer civilizations stand atop older ones, inheriting and adapting ruins they could not have built themselves. Why is it that the further back we go, the larger and more advanced the stonework becomes? Mainstream archaeology calls it coincidence, the result of lost techniques or exaggerated labor. Yet the consistency across continents suggests more. It suggests that the earliest builders were survivors of a civilization with knowledge we no longer understand. They built in stone because stone alone could endure the flood. Their cities may have vanished, their machines may have rusted away, their books may have dissolved into silt, but the stones remained. Later cultures, finding these indestructible ruins, repurposed them as temples and palaces, adding their own layers without ever matching the power of the foundations. The flood may have been the dividing line. Before it, an advanced civilization built in megaliths, aligning their monuments with the heavens, encoding knowledge in geometry and scale. After it, survivors struggled to rebuild, passing down fragments of knowledge but lacking the tools to recreate what they had lost. The pattern of ruins tells us this story silently. Strength below, refinement above. Power at the base, art at the surface. Each site is a palimpsest, a layered memory of two worlds, the world before the waters and the world after. This inversion of history unsettles us because it reverses the story we like to tell. We imagine ourselves as the pinnacle, the culmination of a steady climb. But the ruins suggest otherwise. They suggest that history is not progress but recovery, that our beginnings were not crude but sophisticated, and that we live in the shadow of ancestors more advanced than we dare admit. And perhaps this is why myths speak of giants, gods, and sages. To those who inherited the ruins, the builders must have seemed larger than life, beings of immense knowledge and strength. The flood erased their world, but their stones survived, towering over later generations as silent witnesses. Unable to comprehend them, people turned them into legends. Giants built them, gods placed them, sages taught them. The truth, buried beneath layers of time, is that they were simply survivors of a world we no longer remember. The stones, then, are not anomalies, but archives. They tell us that our story did not begin with us. It began with a civilization erased by flood, whose remnants lie beneath our temples, beneath our palaces, beneath the very cities we live in today. To dig downward is to dig into memory, to touch the world before the waters, a world we once called myth, but may one day have to call history. Look closely at the oldest myths, and you'll find the same refrain. Knowledge came from the sky. Gods descended in shining chariots. Sages emerged from stars. Civilizers bore names that linked them to constellations, to the sun, to the moon. It is tempting to see this as fantasy, the imagination of people gazing upward in awe. But what if it is something else? What if these myths are distorted memories, not of extraterrestrial visitors, but of survivors of a drowned world? Men and women whose knowledge of the heavens seemed so otherworldly that later generations turned them into gods of the sky? In Sumer, the Anunnaki were said to descend from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They brought writing, agriculture, and astronomy, shaping the very foundations of Mesopotamian society. To the Sumerians, they were gods. To us, they may have been survivors, astronomers who carried forward star maps from a world erased. Their stories entwine with the flood itself. Utnapishtim, saved by divine warning, humanity reset by water, guided once again by celestial beings. The line between divine and human blurs, as if the stars themselves were only metaphors for knowledge preserved across catastrophe. The Dogon people of Mali tell an even stranger story. Their traditions speak of the Nomo, beings who came from the Sirius star system and taught them language, agriculture, and cosmology. The Dogon described Sirius as a double star long before modern telescopes confirmed it. How could such knowledge exist without instruments? Some argue for extraterrestrial contact. Others suggest something subtler, that survivors of the flood carried fragments of advanced astronomy, encoded them in myth, and over generations those fragments transformed into stories of beings from the sky. For the Dogon, it was not memory of instruments, but of teachers. The stars became their teachers' home, because only the heavens seemed vast enough to explain the depth of their knowledge. Egypt, too, preserves echoes of sky gods. Thoth, god of wisdom, is depicted with the moon and stars, keeper of time and measure. Osiris himself was said to have descended from Orion, while Isis was linked to Sirius. The alignments of the pyramids with Orion's belt and Sirius suggest these were not just symbolic, but functional, a way to anchor monuments to the stars, ensuring that knowledge and cycles would survive beyond the flood. To later Egyptians, these alignments were divine. To the builders, they may have been survival, cosmology preserved in stone so it would not drown. In the Andes, Viracocha, the bearded god, emerged after a flood to teach humanity, then departed across the sea, promising to return. He was often associated with the sun and stars, described as shining, radiant, a figure of light. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, also tied to Venus, brought knowledge of calendars, agriculture, and astronomy. When he left, he too promised to return. Different lands, different names, but the same theme. Beings from the sky, bringers of wisdom, tied to celestial cycles, remembered as divine. Even in Polynesia, navigators told of ancestors guided by star beings who showed them how to cross the vast Pacific by reading constellations, currents, and birds. To them, navigation was not merely skill, but sacred inheritance, given by luminous figures who came after upheaval. Once again, the survival of cosmology is transformed into a story of gods. Survivors who knew the stars may have seemed like beings of light themselves, their knowledge beyond comprehension, their origins assumed to be the heavens. Some researchers interpret these stories literally, as ancient alien contact. Others see them as allegory. But perhaps the truth lies in between. Survivors of a global flood, scattered across continents, carried with them the most durable form of knowledge, the stars. Everything else could be lost, books, tools, even cities, but the heavens remained unchanged. By encoding their science in constellations, by linking their teachers to Orion, Sirius, or Venus, they ensured the memory would endure. Over centuries, what began as cosmology hardened into mythology, and teachers became gods. Yet the possibility of true visitors from beyond cannot be dismissed entirely. Myths do more than describe knowledge. They describe descent. Chariots of fire, shining discs, beings clothed in light descending from the sky. In India's Mahabharata, celestial weapons are described with imagery reminiscent of modern technology. Blinding flashes, thunderous blasts, fallout that poisons the land. Are these poetic metaphors or faint recollections of technologies lost in the flood? Could the sky beings have been both? Survivors with advanced tools mistaken for gods, and perhaps visitors from beyond, whose timing coincided with catastrophe? The fascination lies in the ambiguity. The flood wiped away so much that what remains is half memory, half myth. Survivors may have deliberately cloaked their knowledge in divine imagery, knowing that story survives longer than instruction. A star map can be forgotten, but a tale of gods descending endures. By teaching through myth, they ensured that fragments of their world would survive long enough to resurface when humanity was ready. The enduring presence of sky gods across cultures is itself a kind of proof. Orion, Sirius, Venus, the Pleiades, these stars appear not just in one culture's myth, but in dozens, oceans apart. Why would peoples with no contact choose the same stars as central symbols? Unless those stars were anchors of memory, markers chosen by survivors who scattered across the world, repeating the same lessons to different children. In their myths, the flood is the dividing line, and the sky is the bridge that carried knowledge from one world to the next. When we look up today, we see constellations as lines on a map, curiosities of culture. But to ancient peoples, they were living archives, stories written in light. The flood erased their libraries, but it could not erase the sky. And so they pointed upward, taught their children the names of stars, and told them, "This is where knowledge comes from. Remember it. Pass it on." The great flood drowned a world, but the survivors lifted their eyes to the heavens and turned them into memory. Whether they were truly gods or simply people with knowledge vast enough to seem divine, their message is the same. We are not the first to look up and understand. We are not the first to measure time in stars, to map the heavens, to wonder if we are alone. The sky beings are not fantasy. They are memory, encoded in the only place water could not reach, the eternal vault above. For thousands of years, the Great Flood lived only in stories, half history, half myth. Priests recited it, poets reshaped it, skeptics dismissed it. But now, for the first time in human history, we have tools that allow us to look beneath the waves, beneath the soil, beneath the very surface of the earth. Satellites scan coastlines, sonar maps the seabed, ground-penetrating radar peers into ruins. And the strange thing is this: the deeper we look, the more the earth seems to agree with the myths. The flood was not fantasy. It was real, and its fingerprints are everywhere. In 2001, sonar surveys of the Gulf of Cambay in India revealed the unmistakable geometry of streets, foundations, and plazas lying beneath the water. Divers brought up artifacts, stone tools, beads, even wood fragments that suggested a city older than Harappa or Mesopotamia. Carbon dating placed them at 9,000 years old, predating what we call the first civilizations by millennia. Mainstream archaeology hesitated, unwilling to rewrite the timeline so drastically. Yet the sonar images remain, impossible to erase. They show grids and lines that nature rarely creates. If not human, then what? And if human, then who? In Japan, divers explored the Yonaguni Monument, its terraces and stairways rising like a sunken fortress. For years, debates raged: natural or artificial, sandstone fractures or carved architecture. Geologist Masaki Kimura argued for human design, pointing to sharp angles, flat surfaces, and what may be glyphs etched into the stone. Skeptics resisted, but even skeptics admitted, it looks like a ruin. And the timing? 10,000 years ago, precisely the era when seas rose after the last ice age, when myths say the flood swept the earth. Closer to home, satellite imaging has transformed archaeology. In Cambodia, LiDAR scans of the jungle revealed Angkor was far larger than anyone realized, a sprawling grid of roads, canals, and temples hidden beneath centuries of growth. If LiDAR can uncover entire lost cities in dense forest, what might it reveal beneath silt or ocean sediment? Already, hints appear. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar captured the outlines of massive geometric structures 600 meters deep. Streets, pyramids, even domes, if confirmed, they would be older than any known city. The discovery made headlines, then quietly disappeared. Too disruptive. Too dangerous. Yet the scans exist, their symmetry undeniable. Underwater archaeology has also brought myth to life. In 2000, divers rediscovered Heracleion and Canopus off the coast of Egypt, cities swallowed by the Mediterranean more than 1,000 years ago. Massive statues, temple ruins, even intact ships were found under layers of silt. If cities that recent can vanish so completely, what about those drowned thousands of years earlier? Their ruins would not just be buried, they would be entombed, sealed away beneath layers of time. The technology grows sharper each year. Side-scan sonar paints the seafloor in 3 dimensions. Submersibles dive deeper than ever, exploring trenches and ridges once unreachable. Satellites measure subtle changes in terrain, uncovering buried walls and ancient riverbeds. Already these tools have revealed forgotten landscapes, vast plains where seas now roll, coastlines where cities once thrived. We are only scratching the surface. 95% of the ocean floor remains unexplored. Beneath those depths may lie the true ruins of the world before the flood. But what is most striking is the consistency between what we find and what the myths have always said. The myths told of cities drowned, of temples lost to the sea, of worlds reset by water. For centuries, scholars dismissed these as allegories. Now sonar and satellites show us drowned cities. Archaeologists pull artifacts from beneath the waves. The earth itself speaks, and its voice echoes the stories. The myths may not have been imagination at all, but memory. Blurred, refracted, but essentially true. Some researchers believe we stand on the brink of a revolution. As sonar and satellite data accumulate, the evidence for pre-flood civilizations may become impossible to deny. One day, the flood will no longer be myth. It will be history, supported not only by stories and ruins, but by maps, scans, and charts. What will it mean when we finally admit that the flood erased a world older than our own? That humanity is not the first chapter, but a continuation? Already, hints of global networks appear in the data. Sites separated by oceans show similar alignments, similar patterns, similar myths. The more we uncover, the more it looks as though these sites were not isolated but connected, fragments of a civilization with global reach. The flood scattered them, buried them, drowned them. But now, piece by piece, technology allows us to find them again. Each scan is a resurrection, each dive a whisper from the past. And yet, there is resistance. To accept a pre-flood civilization is to rewrite history, to challenge the foundations of archaeology, to admit that myth can be truer than textbooks. It is safer to dismiss anomalies, to call them coincidences, to file them away as mysteries unsolved. But the evidence grows heavier, and the flood stories grow louder. With every sonar scan, with every LiDAR map, with every dive into the blue silence, we come closer to admitting the truth. The flood was not the end of myth. It was the end of memory. What lies ahead is discovery, on a scale we can hardly imagine. If even one of the suspected drowned cities proves genuine, it will change everything. The myths will no longer be myths. They will be history, spoken in the language of survivors, preserved in stone and story until our tools were sharp enough to hear them again. The flood did not erase the past completely. It only hid it. And now, for the first time in 12,000 years, we may be ready to see what it concealed. The story of the Great Flood has followed us like a shadow across millennia. It is whispered in scripture, carved in stone, sung in myth, and now revealed in the silent testimony of the earth itself. We began by dismissing it as allegory, a parable about morality, a bedtime story of gods and punishment. But the more we dig, the more we scan, the more we listen, the more the flood steps out of legend and into history. The myths, the ruins, the anomalies, the geological scars, they all align like pieces of a shattered mosaic, hinting that what we call civilization is only the latest chapter in a far older book. If the flood was real, and evidence suggests it was, then it wasn't just a natural disaster but a turning point in human history. It erased entire coastlines, drowned cities, and ended a world system we can barely imagine. It scattered survivors who carried with them fragments of knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, architecture, myth. They rebuilt where they could, encoding warnings in monuments, aligning temples with stars, retelling stories of gods and giants so their children would not forget. But over centuries, memory blurred into legend, and legend hardened into myth. We inherited the ruins but lost the context. We inherited the stories but forgot the event. And so the flood became a tale, stripped of its reality until science, geology, sonar, satellites began to rediscover what was always there. Look at the evidence. The channeled scablons, carved in days by walls of water moving faster than sound. The Black Sea basin, flooded suddenly and violently 7,000 years ago. The Gulf of Cambay, where sonar reveals streets beneath the sea. Yonaguni, with its drowned stairways. Baalbek, with stones no modern crane could lift. Göbekli Tepe, aligned with stars and built before history officially began. These are not scattered mysteries. They are fragments of a single truth. The flood happened. It destroyed not only landscapes but a civilization, one whose memory echoes through myth. And what of the giants, the gods, the sky beings? They may not have been literal, but they were real in another sense. Survivors whose stature, physical, intellectual, or technological, towered over the people who inherited their world. To those who came after, they seemed divine. To us, they seem mythical. But perhaps they were simply human, or nearly human, carrying pieces of knowledge across the deluge, trying desperately to keep the fire alive in a drowned world. They succeeded. Partly. Enough survived to ignite Sumer, Egypt, the Maya, the Polynesians. But much was lost, leaving us to rebuild without knowing we were not the first. The flood also shaped our psyche. It etched fear of divine wrath into our religions and longing for a lost paradise into our myths. It gave us Eden, Zep Tepi, the Golden Age, the first time. It made us dream of what was destroyed and dread what could return. Perhaps this is why humanity is obsessed with apocalypse stories, why we fear global warming, rising seas, or asteroids. Deep down, we remember. The trauma of the flood lingers in our blood, in our myths, in our very sense of time. We know the world can end because it already has. Yet the flood was not only destruction, it was also transmission. It ensured that fragments of a greater world would survive, scattered but not extinguished. Myths became vessels, carrying memory across millennia. Stones became books, encoding geometry and astronomy. Survivors became gods, their knowledge reimagined but never fully lost. We are the children of those fragments, the heirs of survivors, rebuilding what was drowned. Our science, our technology, our maps of the stars, all may be rediscoveries, echoes of a song first sung before the waters came. And now, with satellites and sonar, we stand at the threshold of remembering. Each new discovery is another piece of the lost world resurfacing, another confirmation that the flood was not fantasy, but fact. What will it mean when we finally admit this? It will mean that history is not linear. It is cyclical. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall, leaving fragments for the next to find. It will mean that we are not the pinnacle, but the continuation, one branch on a tree older than we imagined. It will mean that our arrogance, that we are the first, the greatest, the only, was misplaced. We may be clever, but we are not original. We are rebuilding a world that has already been built before. So what is the lesson of the Great Flood? Perhaps it is humility. The earth is older and stronger than we are. It has erased worlds before and may erase ours again. Our cities, our machines, our archives, all can vanish in days if the waters rise. But it is also hope. For even when worlds drown, fragments survive. Memory endures. Survivors carry seeds, stories, and symbols across the deluge. Civilizations can die, but humanity endures. And in that endurance lies our greatest strength. The flood is not just our past. It is our mirror. It warns us that we live on borrowed time, in a fragile balance with forces greater than ourselves. It reminds us that catastrophe is part of the cycle, that paradise can be lost, but also that from loss comes renewal. We are here because others endured. We stand on the ruins of drowned cities, walk among stones carved by forgotten hands, and look up at stars named by people who lived through the end of the world. Their voices still echo, if we are willing to hear them. The Great Flood was not the end. It was the beginning of our beginning. It drowned one world, but it gave birth to ours. And as we uncover its evidence, in myths, in ruins, in stone, in the silent language of geology, we come closer to understanding that we are not the first civilization, and perhaps not the last. The flood whispers across time. Remember us, learn from us, for the waters may rise again.